Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to be discussing the ETH Bitcoin valuation and talking about the evidence for the bottom being in and the evidence for it not being in. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, to begin with, I must remind people, as always, that there is a fundamental difference between ETH USD and ETH Bitcoin, right? ETH Bitcoin is the valuation of ETH against Bitcoin, right? Therefore, ETH Bitcoin going up or ETH Bitcoin going down doesn't necessarily tell you the direction of ETH USD, right? It doesn't. In fact, in 2019, when ETH Bitcoin bottomed, ETH USD still had not yet bottomed in that year. So it's important to remember that there's a nuance behind it. Now, what I have found is that new people to the cryptoverse tend to think in terms of the USD valuation because that's what they always value things in. The longer you're in the cryptoverse, the more likely you are to value your portfolio in Satoshis because that's what actually matters, right? Do you value your portfolio against the US dollar, which the purchasing power is going asymptotically to zero over a long period of time, or do you value it against Bitcoin, an asset that has proven itself throughout the cycles to generally head higher with time? Of course, there are some pretty brutal bear markets. So because of that, it makes more sense in my view to value ETH on its Bitcoin pair. And for me, the low for ETH Bitcoin for the cycle was always going to be between 0.03 to 0.04. Always, right? I've said that for years, 0.03 to 0.04. And of course, I think most people had no idea that it could actually go that low. And here it is, where it feels like even a rally to 0.039 is seen as bullish, when just about 6 months ago, it was almost inconceivable for people to think about ETH Bitcoin going below 0.04. So there is a case to be made that the low for ETH Bitcoin is either in or very, very close to being in, both in terms of valuation and in terms of time. I would say that after 3 years, we finally have at least a little bit of evidence to suggest the bottom might actually be in. This is the first time that I've looked at the chart and thought maybe it is actually in. And it's been a really frustrating wait because for so long I've been reluctant to say that it could be in on every single one of these lower highs. And on every single one of these lower highs, it was dealing with people sort of laughing and saying there's no way it could possibly go lower. But I will say it is possible that ETH Bitcoin has bottomed. And what I want to do is I want to talk about what is the evidence to suggest the bottom could be in, and what's the evidence that would say, let's hold off before we make any, overly bold proclamations. All right. Now, the first thing is this pattern, right? I mean, this pattern is pretty telling, where you sort of you get your double tops where the second top is a little bit lower. You set a low in between those two tops that eventually acts as support for a while, and then eventually ETH Bitcoin breaks down. In 2016, you can see that ETH Bitcoin fell about 50 something percent after it broke below the range low. In 2019, it fell about 30% after it broke the range low. This cycle, it's already fallen about 30%. And so that's at least some evidence to make me believe that if the low's not in, it's probably getting pretty close, right? And again, I can't say exactly where the bottom is, but I will say this. The current low of 0.03465 is good enough for me, right? It's good enough for me. It's between 0.03 to 0.04. Bitcoin dominance did go to 60%. So who would I be to say that it can't, that it can't have bottomed? I mean, it would fit in with the general theories that I've been presenting, right? 0.03 to 0.04, check. Bitcoin dominance, check. Break below the range low, check. The other thing that is important to point out, and is why I'm starting to think that there's at least a chance, is in 2016 and in 2019, after ETH Bitcoin got above its 50-day moving average, after it durably broke down, the bottom was in fact in, right? So it durably broke down right here. After it durably broke down, once it was back above the 50-day moving out, and when I say durably, I mean for more than just a few days, right? Because these are just sort of fake breakdowns. Once it durably broke down, you can see that when the 50-day SMA was crossed, right? Once ETH Bitcoin crossed the 50-day SMA on a daily close, the bottom was in, right? It didn't look back. It rallied, it consolidated, and then it went up. So that's one point. That's 2016. If you look at 2019, you'll see something very similar, right? Where after it durably broke down, once it got a daily close above the 50-day moving average, the bottom was in fact in. Now, it did come back down later to form a higher low, but the actual bottom was already in. We didn't know it at the time, right? We had this rally back up to the prior support level. We got rejected, came all the way back down, and we more or less formed a double bottom, right? Where it was just a slightly higher low, but for all intents and purposes, it was just a double bottom. This was at 0.016. This was at 0.0169. I mean, it was basically the same valuation, just a slight difference. So that meant the bottom was in. And so I've said for a number of months now that whenever it gets back above the 50-day SMA after durably breaking down, then the bottom could be in, right? It doesn't have to be, but the odds start to go up. If you think back after the first rate cut, there was a rally by ETH Bitcoin up to the 50-day moving average. And there was a wick above it, but it ended up closing below it. This time, we at least got a close above the 50-day moving average. Now, to be completely honest, I'd like to see more than one, right? I'd like to just see another daily close to help really solidify these views. It could still just simply be a fake out, right? The rally to the 50-day SMA back over here was right after the first rate cut, and this rally here is right after the second rate cut. So there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin doesn't hold the 50-day and it just ends up being a one-day fake out that we look back on and we're like, well, it was just a fake out just like it was after the first rate cut. But I have to take the data as it comes in. And, after in 2016 and 2019, when ETH Bitcoin crossed the 50-day SMA on a daily close, the bottom was in fact in. Okay, so that's more evidence to suggest that it is possible. Some more evidence to suggest that the bottom could theoretically be in would be that if you were to look at rate cuts, we know that in 2019, ETH Bitcoin bottomed about 5 weeks after the first rate cut, right? The first rate cut was in late July, and then ETH Bitcoin bottomed in early September, right around the time of the second rate cut. Same thing, right? The first rate cut was in September, and about 5 weeks later, ETH Bitcoin hit 0.03465 right around the time of the second rate cut. So there's a chance that it's just playing out in a very similar structure, right? Where you start to get these rate cuts and then ETH Bitcoin bottoms, right? We're getting rate cuts and then maybe ETH Bitcoin bottoms out. But that's just one more thing, right? That's more evidence to suggest that it could be in, but there's still no way to know for sure. There is evidence to suggest that it could still go lower. And my argument all along has been that if ETH Bitcoin is going to go lower, it's probably going to do so before 2025. That would be my best guess at this point with the information that I have, right? If it's going to go below the current low, it'll do so before the end of the year. And the reason I say that is because historically, in the year that ETH Bitcoin breaks down, it forms the bottom structure and starts moving back up in December of that year, right? This was December of 2019. This was December of 2016. So if it's going to go lower, I think it'll do so before the end of the year. The one thing to consider that makes me, you know, that keeps me from just saying it with more confidence. Right now, I'm probably like, say, 60-40, right? I'm more so leaning towards it being in than not, especially because dominance has hit 60. But I also know there are a couple of things that could come back to sort of question the idea of whether the bottom is in. And whether the bottom is in or not, there's likely going to be a period at some point in the future where we're not going to know, right? It's going to go back down from a certain level, and we're going to wonder, was that actually the bottom or not? And so one of the things that I go back to is that, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin actually bottomed when quantitative tightening ended, right? That's when the bottom actually occurred, almost to the T. I mean, basically to the week, right? I mean, QT ended, ETH Bitcoin bottomed, and QT hasn't actually ended yet. Quantitative tightening hasn't actually ended. And so because quantitative tightening is going to likely continue for at least a little while, there is a chance that ETH Bitcoin could go lower. So, it's important to remember that while there's some evidence to suggest that it could be in, there's also some that would push back against that idea. You're probably wondering, well, how is this useful to you? My argument, as it relates to ETH Bitcoin, is that for me, and I could be wrong, but for me, 0.03465 is good enough, right? I don't need to hold out for longer to see if it goes lower. I think these are fairly attractive valuations for ETH Bitcoin. Now, where I've gotten myself into a lot of trouble with people are my views on ETH USD, right? And I've talked a lot about ETH eventually coming home on its USD pair. I will say this, right? First of all, I don't get everything right. I certainly don't. Second of all, in the video where I said ETH could come home in December, I also said that with ETH Bitcoin at 0.035, it makes sense to start hedging that view. And I have already actively started hedging against that view, right? And so there's part of me that wants to see ETH go home. There's another part of me that's actively hedging against that view. So, yes, the Twitter trolls will say what they want to say, like they normally do. But the reality is most of them spent the last 3 years calling the bottom on ETH Bitcoin, and they were wrong every step of the way. And, of course, now they're sort of laughing at the Ethereum going home theory. But the reality is they're always going to be there, right? There's always going to be trolls there. They're going to have an opinion about something. And if you check their history, they basically just say the same thing over and over again. So I would say, it's important to remember that these things take time to play out. And it's also important to remember that I myself acknowledge that I get things wrong, right? And it could be that I'm wrong about ETH USD going home. And if you're new to the channel, the idea about ETH USD going home is essentially that every year that ETH Bitcoin has broken down, ETH USD went to the lower logarithmic regression trend line in December of that year. That is the argument, right? That, when it breaks down, ETH USD continues to drop. So the first thing I would say is there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin has bottomed, right? And then ETH USD still goes down in December. And then I imagine if that were to happen, people would get upset because they'll be like, well, what about ETH Bitcoin bottoming? But again, ETH Bitcoin is not the same as ETH USD, right? It's not. If ETH Bitcoin has bottomed, which we don't know for sure, but if it has, there still is a risk that ETH USD drops again in December, even if it's not the most likely scenario. The one thing that, I think it's important to come to terms with is the only way, and I'll do another video on this, sort of a dedicated video on it, but the only way for ETH to go home is for the broader market to sell off, right? There's not a compelling, there's not a compelling case to be made that ETH USD drops back below $2,000 and Bitcoin's not also dropping. And the reason why that's a hard, sort of a hard pill to swallow is because in order for that to happen, Bitcoin would have to drop. That wasn't true earlier this year, right? Earlier this year, Bitcoin was mostly just going sideways since March, while ETH was dropping, right? So you could have argued that had Bitcoin just continued in that path, eventually ETH would have gone down here because Bitcoin was just absorbing that liquidity from ETH. But now it seems like we've sort of slowly started to enter a new phase of the cycle where ETH Bitcoin could start to turn things around, especially in 2025. So the sobering reality for ETH USD is that the only way it goes home is if Bitcoin drops, right? And so that's the reason why, having some ETH in a portfolio, I think can make some sense, is because it does give you exposure to the upside. But if ETH does go home, there's a good chance that Bitcoin would have also experienced a similar drop. So by having it in Bitcoin, it's not like you would have even necessarily been better off at that point. Maybe slightly if ETH Bitcoin does go a slightly lower low in December, but I don't think it would be that much of a difference at this point. So for the last 3 years, I've just said stay Bitcoin heavy because Bitcoin dominance is going to 60%. Going into 2025, right? I mean, the closer you get, I think it really starts to make sense to hedge. And so I think that is the sort of the appropriate stance, is to hedge a little bit here and there with some ETH, because there's no guarantee that ETH USD does go home. And I'll tell you this, if you have a multi-year view about something, about ETH Bitcoin going to 0.03 to 0.04 and Bitcoin dominance going to 60%, I cannot, with a clear conscience, watch 0.03 to 0.04 come and go and not do a thing about it, right? I can't just say, oh, well, I was right, but I didn't actually make any adjustments to my portfolio. So it was Bitcoin heavy until 60% dominance, right? It wasn't Bitcoin heavy until 60% and then do nothing, right? It was Bitcoin heavy until 60%. We hit 60%. So I think it makes sense to start expanding the view. There is a risk with that. And I've talked about this before. There's a risk, and I don't really think a lot of people are considering it. And I'm not even saying that they should be considering it, because the reality, right? The reality is that for Bitcoin to go down, right? For Bitcoin to really go down at this point, it would have to fade all sorts of seasonality, right? I mean, year-to-date ROI, and there does exist a scenario where it just does it in 2025 and not 2024. But year-to-date seasonality in halving years, Bitcoin normally goes up. And I've said for months that it makes sense to defer to the cyclical view until proven otherwise. And it's still going well. If you look at the ROI from the low for Bitcoin, it is still generally tracking the prior cycles. And in fact, it just put on a new all-time high yesterday. So far, the cyclical view has been correct. So to speculate that ETH could theoretically go home this year would imply that Bitcoin experiences a correction. But again, is that something you really want to root for? If it happens, it happens. And the market does occasionally drop a lot, right? I mean, it's not like Bitcoin is immune to some, stomach turning drops where you feel like everything's never going to go back up again. But I just want people to understand that I can have multiple views, right? ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD. I can start hedging by getting some ETH while also retaining the idea that there is a chance, even if it's not necessarily the most likely at this point, there's a chance that ETH USD still drops in December. And I don't know what the catalyst would be. I don't. The reality is, with the momentum behind Bitcoin and everything, it seems somewhat foolish to sort of, hammer down that it has to happen, right? I'd rather just say ETH Bitcoin has reached the bottoming range, and therefore it makes sense to have some ETH. The same thing with Bitcoin, right? When I first made my portfolio Bitcoin heavy in early 2022, I had to live with some downside for a while, right? But then eventually it went back up, and I bought Bitcoin in late 2022. I didn't buy ETH because I just thought ETH Bitcoin was going to bleed, and I stand by that. I don't apologize for that view. I think some people think, well, you missed out on ETH at $1,000. Guys, Bitcoin outperformed ETH 2x since the beginning of 2022, right? And even since the merge, right? It's outperformed ETH 2x. I didn't miss out on anything. Bitcoin heavy was the way to go, right? Now, if you value your portfolio in US dollars, you might not agree, but if you value it in Satoshis, it makes complete sense. So in this case, I just wanted to do that segue to ETH USD because I know some people want to know about it, right? Is ETH coming home? And the reality is I can't promise you anything about it, right? I can say that it has followed the pattern so far. It is starting to deviate somewhat from that view, right? I wasn't expecting ETH to get this big of a move in November, but it could still happen. But it's not something that's worthwhile to, completely sit out and say, well, it has to happen. Because if you value your portfolio in sats, I would say ETH Bitcoin is already close enough. If you value it in US dollars, you could still say it's close enough as well. I just don't want everyone thinking that it's something that has to happen. I've presented the theory many times as to why I think it could happen, but I don't want you to think that it has to happen. And I want you to also know that I'm already actively hedging against that view. Because ETH Bitcoin, I think, is pretty close to a bottom if the bottom is not already in. The worst case scenario for ETH Bitcoin, as I've said, in my opinion, is 0.03. I don't really think it's going to go that low, but there does exist a world where it happens, right? If it truly does just bleed until quantitative tightening is over, then there's a chance that it just does that. I would argue there's a chance that it gets a bounce and then maybe double bottoms around the time that QT is over. Or maybe it's a slightly lower low, maybe it's a slightly higher low. But that's where I am right now. I just know that when the bottom is in, usually for ETH Bitcoin, like when it's in, after it durably breaks down, you normally get a fairly explosive move where ETH USD gets a really big bounce. It did the exact same thing in 2019, right? If you look at 2019, ETH Bitcoin bottomed the week of September 2nd. And this is what happened the week of September 2nd, right? ETH USD began a rally of about 33%. Okay. Now, if you compare that to today and how far ETH has gone up just since this most recent low by ETH Bitcoin, it's already up 20%, right? I mean, from the actual low over here, it's up more than that, but we're not measuring it from there, right? I'm just measuring it from when ETH Bitcoin potentially bottomed, right? It's up 26, 27%. So you would generally expect that whenever the bottom occurs, it would be a fairly explosive rally for ETH Bitcoin and for ETH USD. If ETH Bitcoin can stay above its 50-day moving average, then the next area of resistance will be the bull market support band, which is all the way up at around 0.042 to 0.043. So that will be, a interesting level to see if ETH Bitcoin can actually get through it. If you look at 2016, you can see that it sort of rallied up for a little bit, and then it kind of paused for a few weeks, and then it went up later on in 2017. If you look at 2019, you can see that when it finally bottomed, it rallied up to the bull market support band, but then it ultimately just got rejected and came back down, double bottomed, and then went up. So my argument is just simply that there's some evidence. The evidence is starting to mount that the low is either in or close to being in. There's no such thing as a sure thing in the market. There is a reality where we just sort of check back in here in a month and it's just simply lower than it is today, right? Maybe it's at 0.032 or something. The one thing I would say beyond the QT argument, the one main thing that makes me think that there is still a chance that it could go lower and it's not like a sure thing, not that it ever is, but is the fact that, Bitcoin dominance normally goes up in Q4 of the halving year, right? I mean, it normally does, but this year, Bitcoin dominance has done all sorts of things that it doesn't normally do. If you look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stables in 2024, it's mostly just gone up all year. This is a pretty big drop here after dominance hit 60%, which is what I said was likely the top. or at least the best guess of a top. It could overshoot it in December, but that was my best guess. But if you look at 2020 and 2016, you can see that dominance normally goes up the last month of the year, right? And there can be a drop around the November timeframe. As you can see back over here, there was a drop. But dominance it normally goes up at the end of the halving year. And so when you look at like alt Bitcoin pairs, for instance, if you were to look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, what you'll notice, so let me try to remove, let's see if I can remove all this stuff really quick. So here, if you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, one of the things you'll notice is that in November of the halving year, especially last halving year, there was a 2-week period where alt Bitcoin pairs went up in mid-November. And then Bitcoin dominance still went up after that, right? Alt Bitcoin pairs still sold off into the end of the halving year. So there does exist a scenario where it's just sort of like a 2-week rally and then alt Bitcoin pairs sell off. My argument is that there does exist a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs sell off, but ETH Bitcoin doesn't go lower, or if it does go lower, it doesn't go that much lower. That is the argument that I'm trying to make. At the end of the day, I can't know for sure when exactly the bottom is going to occur for ETH Bitcoin, right? It's a falling knife to some degree until proven otherwise. I'm just saying that, just from an academic perspective, this level, it's the first time in 3 years where I thought maybe it could be the bottom, right? Before today, or really before a few days ago when it hit that level, I hadn't even really thought about it being the bottom before too much, right? I mean, it always just seemed like it was going to go lower, right? Because Bitcoin dominance always seemed like it was going to go higher. But now, with dominance at 60, and it being about the same time after the first rate cut, and ETH Bitcoin getting above the 50-day SMA, right? It seems, and Bitcoin dominance hitting 60%, right? It seems like it's at least worthwhile of a discussion, right? It's at least worth discussing if the bottom is in, even if it does go lower, right? I think the discussion begins now, right? The discussion begins November of 2024. I don't know exactly how long it's going to take to really confirm it, but for me, 0.03465 is good enough, right? I don't feel like it has to go lower. I think that very well could be the bottom or relatively close to it. If it's going to go lower, I think it'll do it before the end of the year. That is my best guess as it relates to the ETH Bitcoin valuation. So I hope you can understand that, it's a theory that was a long time in the making. We did see it go to 0.03 to 0.04. The last piece of the puzzle for me is, does ETH USD actually go to lower logarithmic regression trend line? What I would hate for people to do is to assume that has to happen and then watch 0.03 to 0.04 come and go, right? So that's why, I will continue to say hedging against that view makes sense. Some people can't get, they can't think about it like that. They want to know, is the bottom in or not? And any other answer is not useful to them for some reason, right? As if anyone knows where things exactly bottom. So the hard part with ETH USD, as I said earlier, is that the only way it goes down is if Bitcoin goes down. And that would be generally fading good seasonality for Bitcoin. What I would say to look for ETH USD is what happens with Bitcoin here, right? I mean, like, does it just continue to break out and follow that typical halving year pattern? I would say this: if Bitcoin were to come back down to this trend line here, then it would certainly favor ETH going home, right? That doesn't mean that ETH would go home at that trend line, but I'm just saying if it were to drop back down there, it would show that there's maybe some more weakness in the market that people are not actually considering. So that's where I am right now. I mean, I think it makes sense to ride the cyclical view as long as possible until proven otherwise. I do think if Bitcoin were to drop back below 70K, that would be a red flag, right? If it were to go back below 7, and I said before, right? I mean, defer to the cyclical view. A weekly close above 70K definitely diverted the cyclical view. And we got those weekly closes above 70K, and you can see that Bitcoin shot up 11%. So I do think it makes sense to defer to the cyclical view as long as Bitcoin is above 70K. If Bitcoin goes below 70K again in the short term, then it's possible we get the landing, right, which takes ETH USD home. But it's not necessarily something you should bet the family farm on, right? Especially with, with Bitcoin well above 70K. So that's where I am. That's how I'm managing my own portfolio. I hope that makes sense. I'm doing the best I can. It's difficult because you when you have large audiences like this, you're kind of expected to have a strong opinion about things, and take a stand. And the markets move in very in stochastic ways, right? They don't go in one direction all the time. So every time they zig and zag, you have to answer for it. I remember doing sort of like apologizing to all the people that were saying I was wrong about ETH Bitcoin back in May when it got this rally. You guys remember that, right? When I was saying it was going to go to 0.03 to 0.04, and then ETH Bitcoin got this rally, and everyone was dunking on me on Twitter. And I had to go on there and be like, all right, like maybe I'm wrong. But I even contended back then, and I posted January, February, and May were the same times that ETH Bitcoin rallied in 2019. And I'm like, why can't they do the same thing in 2024? And that's exactly what they did, right? But in the moment, good luck convincing anyone of that back then, right? In May of 2024, good luck convincing, the ETH maxis that it could go lower from there. There was no point. I mean, I've learned that there's not really a point in doing it, in arguing, because if you're right, they'll rationalize it later on. They'll blame you for it occurring. And if you're wrong, well, you never hear the end of it. You just become sort of the punching bag. So it gets tiresome after a while, right? It gets tiresome dealing with it after a while. And I don't really want to deal with it anymore, to be honest. I don't really want to. So, for me, ETH Bitcoin is close enough to whatever the bottom's going to be. Just for completeness, I'll follow it through, to the end of the year, and we'll see where we are. But I think it at least makes sense to start thinking about, is this the bottom? If it's not the bottom, how much further down could we go? Whereas before, it always felt like it was premature to consider that the bottom could be in for ETH Bitcoin. So, and again, ETH USD is not the same thing as ETH Bitcoin. Please understand that. Please understand it. There's a difference between converting your Bitcoin to ETH and converting your US dollars to ETH, right? There's a difference. And I think some people don't understand that difference. And it's getting tiring, reminding people that there is, in fact, a difference between ETH Bitcoin and ETH USD. ETH Bitcoin is much easier to predict than ETH USD. The reason, because ETH USD is just dependent on what Bitcoin does. But ETH Bitcoin is more so dependent on monetary policy and other things like interest rates and quantitative tightening, that sort of stuff. It's more obviously dependent on that than the USD valuation of Ethereum is, right? The USD valuation of Ethereum is just mainly dependent on what Bitcoin does. And, predicting exactly where Bitcoin's going to go is so difficult. And of course, there's people that claim to predict it, but I don't know very many people who told you back in March that it was just going to bleed for 6 to 9 months and then start to go back up after, sometime after the 6 to 9 month window. Not a lot of people were saying that, right? Most people were either calling for a major move to the 100K back in April, or they were calling just for, Bitcoin to just crash altogether. A lot of people were saying sort of a slow bleed for 6 to 9 months, followed by a breakout to new all-time highs until we get moving again. There still could be a landing, right? The only way that ETH goes home at this point on its USD pair is if there's a landing. But again, this video has gone on long enough. We'll talk about that in another video. But for the time being, I don't, I think the idiosyncratic risk of ETH is not as high as it used to be. I think what Ethereum does from here on out is more so just dependent on the market risk, right? If Bitcoin goes down, it'll probably go down commensurate with Bitcoin. If Bitcoin goes up, perhaps it'll go commensurately up with Bitcoin. But I think we're nearing the end of the phase where it, for a long time, we were just in the phase of if Bitcoin goes up, ETH goes down. If Bitcoin goes sideways, ETH goes down. And if Bitcoin goes down, ETH goes down, right? I mean, it would seem like no matter what Bitcoin did, ETH went down. I think we're ending that phase, right? I think we're ending that phase and sort of transitioning into a new phase which is why it starts to make sense to talk about, all right, has it bottomed? It does, in my opinion, start to make sense to hedge the ETH USD going home narrative because ETH Bitcoin is likely very close to a bottom. The one thing to consider is that when in 2019, when ETH Bitcoin bottomed and it bounced, that bounce occurred actually while ETH USD, it did go up temporarily, but then eventually it went lower, right? If you look at ETH USD, you can see that like ETH USD bounced, but then eventually it did go lower into December of that year. So honestly, I'm not married to the idea. I've always valued the Bitcoin valuations more than the USD valuations, and so I'm more happy to see that the Bitcoin valuation has played out. If the USD narrative also comes true, I feel like that's just sort of the icing on the cake. It's not something that has to happen and that you have to bet everything you have on the idea, right? It's something that, if it does happen, it'll just be a carbon copy of the last two cycles. If it doesn't happen, then this cycle is deviating from the last two cycles, which it's possible that it could be. But anyways, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and we'll continue to discuss, whether ETH Bitcoin has bottomed or not. There's certainly some evidence mounting that make the case that it's either in or it's really close to being in. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye.